The morning started like any other at Adelaide Cottage. Prince George walked toward the kitchen, his school uniform neat, his backpack slung over one shoulder. But something felt different. Someone was watching him, not his father, not his mother. Someone else. George stopped at the doorway. A man stood near the window. Tall, broad-shouldered, with gray beginning to show at his temples. He wore a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes swept the room constantly, never resting. "George," his mother Catherine said gently, "this is Mr. Harrison. He'll be with you for a while." George frowned. "With me?" "Yes," Catherine replied, her voice soft but firm. "Starting today." The boy looked at his father, Prince William, who stood by the counter holding a cup of tea. William's face was serious. Not angry, but concerned in a way George had only seen a few times before. "Why?" George asked. William set down his cup. "Because things have changed, son." That phrase hung in the air like fog. Things have changed? But what things? George wanted to ask, but something in his father's tone stopped him. This wasn't a conversation for right now. Mr. Harrison stepped forward. His movements were smooth, but deliberate, like someone who had spent years learning how to move without making noise. "Your Highness," he said, nodding respectfully to George, "I'm here to make sure you're safe." That's all. Safe from what? George thought. But again, he didn't ask. If you're wondering what happens next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this unfolds. The drive to school was quiet. Mr. Harrison sat in the front passenger seat, his eyes constantly moving between the mirrors and the road ahead. George sat in the back with his mother, watching the man's reflection in the window. "Is he a bodyguard?" George whispered. Catherine nodded. "Yes, a very good one, but I've never had one before. Not like this." His mother's hand found his. "You're almost 13, George. Things are different now." There it was again. Different. Changed. Words that explained nothing but suggested everything. When they arrived at school, Mr. Harrison got out first. He scanned the area, his gaze sharp and focused. Only then did he open George's door. "Stay close," Harrison said quietly. George felt a flutter of unease in his chest. He'd been to school hundreds of times, but today it felt like walking into unknown territory as they approached the entrance. George noticed other students staring. Some whispered, a few pointed. He was used to attention, but this felt heavier somehow. Like everyone knew something he did. Inside, Harrison stayed 10 feet back. Close enough to move quickly, far enough to not hover. George went to his locker, pulled out his books, tried to act normal, but normal was gone. At lunch, George sat with his friends. Harrison stood near the wall, arms crossed, watching. One of George's classmates, a boy named Oliver, leaned in. Oliver asked, nodding toward Harrison. George hesitated. Security? Why now? That question again. Why now? George didn't have an answer, but deep down a knot of worry was forming. Something had happened. Something serious enough that his grandfather, King Charles, had personally assigned a veteran guard to shadow him, something his parents weren't telling him yet, and whatever it was, George could feel it closing in. Asterisk that evening. George sat at the dinner table picking at his food. Across from him, his younger sister Charlotte chattered about her day, and little Louis built a tower with his peas, but George barely heard them. His mind was stuck on Harrison. On the way, the man moved. On the way, he watched everything. George. His father's voice cut through his thoughts. George looked up. Yes, you've been quiet. George shrugged. Just thinking. William exchanged a glance with Catherine. A silent conversation passed between them, the kind only parents can have. Then William set down his fork. Come with me, he said. Let's talk. They walked to William's study, a room lined with books and family photographs. William closed the door and gestured to the chair across from his desk. George sat, his heart beating a little faster now. You have questions, William said. I can see it. George nodded. Why is Mr. Harrison here? What happened? William leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy. For a moment he looked older than George had ever seen him. 2 weeks ago, William began slowly. Security services intercepted a communication. Someone had been researching your movements, your schedule, where you go to school, when you leave, when you arrive. George's stomach tightened. Who? We don't know yet, William said. But it was specific, detailed, and it wasn't just curiosity. The room felt colder suddenly. George pulled his arms close to his chest. Your grandfather made the decision immediately, William continued. He called in Harrison personally, one of the best protection officers in the service. Decorated veteran. Trained for exactly this kind of situation. George's voice came out smaller than he wanted. Are they? Are they going to hurt me? William leaned forward, his eyes steady and serious. No, because we're not giving them the chance. That's why Harrison is here. That's why things have changed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the evening sky was turning purple. Somewhere in the house, Charlotte was laughing at something Louis had done. Does Charlotte know? George asked. Or Louis? William shook his head. Not yet. They're too young to carry that weight. But you're almost 13. You're old enough to understand. George felt something shift inside him. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Responsibility. Awareness. The realization that his life was not like other people's lives, and maybe it never would be. What do I do? George asked. You let Harrison do his job, William said. You follow his instructions. And you live your life. You don't let fear win. Over the next few days, George learned Harrison's patterns. The man was always there, but never intrusive. At school, Harrison stayed in the background, blending into the walls and corners. At home, he coordinated with the other security staff, creating layers of protection George had never noticed before, but George noticed something else too. Harrison wasn't just watching for threats. He was watching George, learning his habits, his routines, his moods. One afternoon after school, George found Harrison standing in the garden, looking out over the grounds. Can I ask you something? George said, approaching carefully. Harrison turned, his expression neutral but not unkind. Of course, Your Highness. Have you ever protected someone who got hurt? Harrison's jaw tightened slightly. A flicker of something painful crossed his face. There and gone in a second. Yes, Harrison said quietly. George waited, sensing there was more. A long time ago, Harrison continued, his voice low, I was assigned to protect a diplomat's daughter. She was about your age, smart, brave, reminded me of my own daughter. He paused, his gaze distant now, looking at something George couldn't see. One day I made a mistake, a small one. I looked away for 5 seconds. Harrison's hands curled into fists. That's all it took. 5 seconds. George's chest tightened. What happened? Harrison met his eyes. She survived. But barely. And I swore I'd never let that happen again. The weight of those words settled between them. George understood now. This wasn't just a job for Harrison. This was something personal, something he needed to get right. I won't look away, Harrison said, his voice firm. Not for 5 seconds? Not for one. George nodded slowly. And for the first time since this all began, he felt something besides fear. He felt protected. Asterisk, asterisk. 3 days before George's 13th birthday. Everything changed again. It was late afternoon. George was in his room finishing homework when he heard raised voices downstairs. His father's voice, tense, urgent, then his mother's, quieter but strained. George set down his pen and moved to the door. He opened it just enough to hear, "When?" William was saying this morning. That was Harrison's voice, low and controlled. Confirmed 30 minutes ago. How close? Close enough that we need to move up the timeline. George's pulse quickened. He stepped into the hallway, staying in the shadows. Below, he could see them gathered in the entrance hall. His parents, Harrison, and 2 other security officers George recognized but didn't know by name. Catherine had her hand over her mouth. What does this mean? It means they know about the birthday, Harrison said. They know when. They know where. We have to assume they're planning something. The birthday. His birthday. George felt his legs go weak. Someone was planning something for his birthday. William ran a hand through his hair, a gesture George had seen him make when stressed. What are our options? We cancel the public appearance, one of the other officers said. Keep him here. Lockdown protocol, no. Harrison's voice cut through. That's what they want. To make him afraid, to make him hide, then what? Catherine asked, her voice trembling slightly. Harrison pulled out his phone, showing them something on the screen. We changed the plan. New location. New route. New timing, everything. But we do it quietly. No announcements. No leaks. William nodded slowly. Who knows about the original plan? Too many people, Harrison admitted. Staff, press office, security detail. At least 20 people had access to the schedule. So we trust no one, William said. Harrison's expression was grim. We trust the people in this room. That's it. George backed away from the stairs, his heart pounding. His birthday was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone. But now it felt like a target painted on his back. That night, George couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the low murmur of voices. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on his door. Come in, George said, sitting up. Harrison entered, his suit jacket gone, his tie loosened. He looked tired. Human in a way George hadn't seen before. You should be sleeping, Harrison said. I heard, George replied. Earlier, downstairs. Harrison nodded slowly. He pulled the chair from George's desk and sat down, a respectful distance away. How much did you hear? Enough. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then George asked the question that had been eating at him. Are they going to try something? At my birthday? Harrison considered his answer carefully. We don't know. But we're not taking chances. Why me? George's voice cracked slightly. I'm just a kid. Harrison leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. You're not just a kid. You're second in line to the throne. And to some people, that makes you a symbol. A way to send a message. A way to hurt something bigger than just you. The words stung because they were true. George had always known he was different, but he'd never felt it like this. Never felt the weight of what his name meant. I'm scared, George admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison met his eyes. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. But don't let it control you. How do I do that? You trust me, Harrison said simply. And you keep living. Because the moment you stop living, they win. George nodded, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. Get some sleep, Harrison said, standing. Tomorrow, we start the new plan. As Harrison reached the door, George called out, Mr. Harrison. The man turned. Yes, thank you. For being here? Harrison's expression softened, just slightly. It's my honor, Your Highness. After he left, George lay back down. Sleep still felt impossible. But there was something else now, mixed with the fear. Determination. He wasn't going to let them win. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted. His 13th birthday was coming, and he was going to face it, not hide from it. Outside his window, the night was dark and still. Somewhere in that darkness, maybe someone was watching. Planning. But inside Adelaide Cottage, George wasn't alone. And he wasn't unprotected. Harrison had made a promise. No looking away. Not for 5 seconds. Not for one. And George believed him. Asterisk, the morning of George's 13th birthday arrived, with gray clouds and a light drizzle. Appropriate, George thought. For what should have been a celebration, but felt more like a military operation, Harrison woke him earlier than usual. 5:30, still dark outside. We're moving, Harrison said quietly. New plan starts now. George dressed quickly, his hands fumbling with his shirt buttons. Downstairs, his family was already gathered. Charlotte and Louis were still sleepy, confused about why they were up so early. But Catherine and William wore matching expressions of controlled anxiety. "Happy birthday, darling," Catherine said, pulling George into a tight hug. She held him a moment longer than usual, and George could feel her heart beating fast against his chest. "Thanks, ma'am," he said softly. Louis ran over and crashed into George's legs. "Birthday. Birthday." George smiled despite everything, tousling his little brother's hair. For a moment, the fear lifted. This was still his birthday. Still his family. "Right," William said, clapping his hands together. "Let's go over the plan one more time." They gathered in the study. Harrison pulled out a tablet, showing them a map. "Original plan had you attending the youth center opening in Westminster at 11, Harrison said. "That's not happening." "New plan. Private family visit to Windsor at 9. Only family. Only us. No press. No public." "What about the youth center?" George asked. "They'll be told you're unwell," William said. "Postponed to next month." George frowned. He hated lying, hated disappointing people. But Harrison's expression left no room for argument. "The route to Windsor has been changed 3 times in the last 12 hours, Harrison continued. "The vehicles were switched out at 4 this morning. Only 5 people know we're going. 6, including the driver." "What if someone's watching the house?" Charlotte asked, her voice small. She was only 8, but she understood more than anyone gave her credit for. Harrison knelt down to her level. "They might be. But they'll be watching for us to leave at 9:30, heading toward Westminster. We'll be gone an hour before that, going the opposite direction." The plan made sense, but George couldn't shake the feeling that something could still go wrong. They left through the back entrance at 6:15, while it was still mostly dark. 3 vehicles. George, his parents, and Louis in the middle car. Charlotte with 2 security officers in the front vehicle. Harrison drove the rear vehicle himself, accompanied by 2 more officers. The roads were nearly empty. Rain streaked the windows, and George watched the countryside blur past. His phone buzzed. Messages from friends wishing him happy birthday. He responded with thanks, acting like everything was normal. If only they knew. They arrived at Windsor just after 7. The castle loomed against the gray sky, ancient and imposing. Normally, George loved visiting. Today, it felt like a fortress. Which, he supposed it was. King Charles was waiting inside, standing in the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back. When he saw George, his stern expression softened. "Happy birthday, my boy," Charles said, embracing him. "Thank you, grandfather." Charles pulled back, studying George's face. "You're handling this well." "Better than I did at your age, I suspect." They walked together toward a private sitting room. Harrison and the other security officers spread out, taking positions at every door and window. "I wanted to speak with you," Charles said once they were seated, "about why I chose Harrison specifically." George leaned forward, listening. 20 years ago, Charles began. "Harrison saved my life." George's eyes widened. "He did?" Charles nodded. "I was visiting a conflict zone. Meant to be secure, but intelligence failed. Ambush. 3 attackers." He paused, his gaze distant. "Harrison took 2 bullets protecting me. Kept fighting even while wounded. Refused to let them through." George looked toward the door, where Harrison stood in the corridor beyond, visible through the glass panels. "He nearly died," Charles continued. "Spent months recovering. But when I asked him what he wanted as recognition for his service, he said only one thing: let me keep serving. No medals. No titles, just duty." "Why me, though?" George asked. "Why assign him to me?" Charles met his grandson's eyes. "Because you're precious to me, and because I trust Harrison more than anyone else in the world to keep you safe." The weight of those words settled on George's shoulders. His grandfather, the king, trusted this man completely. And now, George's life was in Harrison's hands. Later, during what was supposed to be a quiet birthday lunch, Harrison's phone buzzed. George saw his expression change instantly. The color drained from Harrison's face. Harrison stepped away, speaking in urgent whispers. Then he returned to William, leaning down to murmur something in his ear. William's fork clattered to his plate. When? 10 minutes ago, Harrison said. Westminster. The youth center. George's stomach dropped. What happened? William and Catherine exchanged looks. Then William turned to George, his face pale. There was a package, William said slowly. Left at the youth center, right where you would have been standing. The room went silent. Even Louis stopped playing with his food. Was anyone hurt? Catherine asked, her voice shaking. Harrison shook his head. Building was evacuated. Bomb squad is there now. Oh. George felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. A package. Where he would have been. If they'd gone with the original plan, they were really going to. George couldn't finish the sentence. Harrison knelt beside his chair. But they didn't, because we changed the plan. Because we were careful. Because we were smarter. George's hands were trembling. His birthday. They'd targeted his birthday. Catherine pulled him close, her arms tight around him. William's hand rested on his shoulder. Across the table, Charlotte's eyes were wide with tears she didn't understand. And in that moment, George understood something he'd never fully grasped before. His life would never be normal. The crown came with a cost. But looking at his family, feeling his mother's arms around him, seeing Harrison's determined face, George knew something else too. He wasn't alone in paying it. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. George's birthday cake was brought out, candles lit, happy birthday sung. But everyone's smiles were forced. Everyone's laughter hollow. George went through the motions. Blew out the candles. Opened presents. Said thank you. But his mind was elsewhere. On the youth center. On the package. On what could have happened. That evening, after Charlotte and Louis were put to bed, George sat with his parents and grandfather in Charles's study. Harrison stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the evening sky. The package was a dummy, Harrison reported. No explosives. But the intent was clear. It was a message. What kind of message? George asked. William hesitated, then answered honestly. That they know your schedule. That they can get close. That they want you to be afraid. Well, it worked, George said, his voice harder than he intended. I am afraid. Charles stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Fear is a weapon, George. But it only works if you let it control you. I'm 13, George said, frustration rising. I'm supposed to be worried about school and football and normal things, not bombs and threats and people trying to hurt me. You're right, Charles said, turning to face him. You shouldn't have to worry about these things. But this is the life you were born into, and I'm sorry for that. George felt tears pricking his eyes. He blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. The question now, Charles continued, is what do we do next? We find them, Harrison said from the window. Intelligence is working on it. We have leads. How long? William asked. Days, maybe weeks, but we'll find them. George stood abruptly. And then what? I just hide until then. Stop living. Stop going to school? No, Harrison said firmly. He crossed the room, standing in front of George. You do the opposite. You live louder. You show them they failed. That sounds dangerous, Catherine said quietly. Life is dangerous, Harrison replied. But hiding isn't living. And if George hides now, he'll hide forever. George looked at his parents. His mother's face was creased with worry. His father's jaw was tight with conflict. But beneath the fear, George saw something else. Pride, trust. What are you suggesting? William asked Harrison. Harrison pulled out his phone, showing them a schedule. Next week, George has a school football match. Public field. Open attendance. I say we go. Catherine shook her head immediately. Absolutely not. With respect, ma'am. Hear me out, Harrison said. We'll have 20 officers positioned around the field. Undercover. We'll have drone surveillance. We'll screen every person who enters. But to the public, to the press, it'll look normal. Like the threat didn't work. You're using my son as bait, Catherine said, her voice shaking with anger. I'm using their psychology against them, Harrison countered. Right now, they think they won. They think George is hiding, scared. If he shows up at that match confident and protected, it sends a different message. It tells them their plan failed. And people who feel like failures make mistakes get sloppy. Charles stroked his chin thoughtfully. It's bold. It's insane, Catherine said. George surprised everyone, including himself. I'll do it. All eyes turned to him. George, his mother started. Ma'am, I can't hide, George said. If I hide now, I'll be hiding for the rest of my life. Harrison's right. I have to live. I have to show them they didn't win. William studied his son's face. George could see his father weighing everything. Risk, responsibility, fear, love. Finally, William nodded slowly. If we do this, we do it Harrison's way. Complete control. Complete security, agreed. Harrison said Catherine looked like she wanted to argue more, but she saw the determination in George's face. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. If anything happens to him, it won't, Harrison said. I promise you. The next morning, George woke to find Harrison already in the hallway outside his room. The man looked like he'd been there all night. Maybe he had. Morning, George said. Morning, Your Highness. Ready for today? What's today? Training. Harrison took George to a private gym in the castle's lower levels. For the next 3 hours, Harrison taught him things George had never imagined learning. How to scan a crowd for threats. How to position himself for maximum protection. How to react if someone grabbed him. How to break a grip. How to run strategically. Not just fast. George's muscles burned. Sweat soaked through his shirt. But he didn't complain. This wasn't just exercise. This was survival. You're fast, Harrison observed. That's good. Speed matters. What else matters? George asked, catching his breath. Awareness. Always know your exits. Always know who's closest to you. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. They practiced scenarios. Someone approaching too quickly. A crowd pressing in. A sudden loud noise. Each time, Harrison corrected George's reactions, fine-tuning his responses. You're not trying to be a hero, Harrison said. You're trying to survive long enough for me to get to you. That's all. 3 seconds. Can you survive 3 seconds? Yes, George said. Show me. They ran the drills again and again, until George's body moved automatically. Until the fear transformed into muscle memory. That night, lying in bed, George felt different. Still scared, but also prepared. Ready, his phone buzzed. A text from his friend Oliver. Can't wait for the match next week. You playing? George stared at the message. Then he typed, Yeah, I'm playing. He hit send and set the phone down. Outside his window, Windsor Castle was lit up against the night sky. Centuries old. Still standing? Still strong, just like him. The match was in 5 days, and George wasn't going to hide. Asterisk, asterisk, the morning of the football match. George woke at 5. Not because he had to. Because he couldn't sleep. He found Harrison in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reviewing maps on his tablet. Security positions. Escape routes. Contingency plans? Nervous? Harrison asked, without looking up. Terrified, George admitted. Harrison set down his coffee. Good. Terrified means alert. Means sharp. I'm more worried about overconfident. They went over the plan one final time. George would arrive with his team 2 hours early. Harrison and 12 undercover officers would already be positioned around the field. Metal detectors at every entrance. Bag searches. No exceptions. Another 8 officers would be in the crowd, dressed as parents and spectators. 2 more in a vehicle parked nearby, ready to extract George at the first sign of trouble. What about my teammates? George asked. Do they know? Harrison shook his head. They think it's normal security. Heightened protocols because you're royal. They don't know about the threat. George nodded. Probably better that way. Less panic. More normal. By the time they arrived at the field at 8 a.m., everything was in place. George could spot the undercover officers now, after his training. The man reading a newspaper by the fence? Too alert. Too watchful. The woman with the coffee cup near the bleachers? Her posture too rigid. The maintenance worker checking the scoreboard? His shoes too clean. George's teammates arrived in groups, laughing and joking. Oliver ran over, grinning. Ready to crush them? George forced a smile. Always. They warmed up. Passing drills. Shooting practice. George tried to focus on the ball, on the game. But his eyes kept drifting to the growing crowd. Parents, students, teachers. Which one didn't belong? Which one was dangerous? George. His coach called, "Head in the game." Right, focus. The opposing team arrived. The stands filled up. George's parents came with Charlotte and Louis, escorted by 4 officers. They sat in a special section, slightly apart from the main crowd. Harrison positioned himself directly behind them. 10 minutes before kickoff, Harrison's earpiece crackled. George saw his expression change. Saw him touch his ear, listening intently. Then Harrison's eyes swept the crowd with new intensity. George's heart rate spiked. Something was wrong. Harrison spoke into his sleeve microphone, too quiet for George to hear. But suddenly all the undercover officers were moving. Subtle shifts. New positions. Tighter formation. The match started. George tried to play, but his awareness was split. Ball, crowd, ball, officers, ball. Exits 15 minutes in, George got the pass. He dribbled forward, defenders closing in. He could take the shot. Clean angle. But something made him look up. There. 3rd row of bleachers. A man with a backpack. Reaching inside, George's training kicked in. He stopped running. Dropped to the ground. Exactly as Harrison had taught him. Immediately, Harrison was moving. 3 officers converged on the man with the backpack. The crowd gasped, confused, alarmed. The man reached into his bag and pulled out a camera. Just a camera. False alarm. Harrison called it off. The officer stepped back. The man, bewildered and angry, demanded to know what was happening. One officer apologized quietly, explaining heightened security measures. George stood up, embarrassed, scared. His teammates were staring at him. The coach ran over. "George, what happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," George said, his voice shaking. I thought, how could he explain? How could he tell them he'd thought someone was about to attack? That every shadow looked like a threat? That he couldn't stop scanning the crowd for danger? "Maybe you should sit out," the coach said gently. "No," George straightened his shoulders. "I'm playing," the match resumed. George forced himself to focus, to trust Harrison, to trust the plan. And slowly, minute by minute, he found his rhythm. A good pass. A blocked shot. A run down the left wing. The game took over. The fear receded. With 2 minutes left, the score was tied 1-1. George got the ball at midfield. He saw the opening. Drove forward. Defenders tried to close in, but he was faster. His training paid off. "Speed matters," Harrison had said. George reached the penalty box. Drew back his foot. Shot. The ball sailed past the goalkeeper's outstretched hands. Hit the back of the net. Goal. The crowd erupted. George's teammates crashed into him, celebrating. In the stands, Louis was jumping up and down. Charlotte was cheering. His parents were on their feet, clapping. And behind them, Harrison was smiling. Actually smiling. The whistle blew. Match over 2-1. Victory. As George walked off the field, Harrison approached. "Well played," George said, still breathing hard. "And thanks for, everything." Harrison nodded. That's my job. It's more than that, George said. You made me feel like I could live again. Not just survive. Actually live. For a moment, Harrison's professional mask slipped. You're a brave kid, Your Highness. Braver than most adults I know. That evening, back at Adelaide Cottage, George sat with his family for dinner. Proper dinner, laughter, stories, normal. His phone buzzed. A news alert. Arrests made in connection with threat against Prince George. 3 suspects in custody. George showed it to his father. William read it and nodded slowly. It's over. George knew better. This threat might be over, but there would be others, because of who he was. Because of what he represented? Harrison's staying, right? George asked. Even now? William smiled. If you want him to? George nodded. I do. That night, before bed, George knocked on the door of the small guest room where Harrison was staying. Come in, Harrison called. George entered. Harrison was sitting at the small desk, writing something in a notebook. He looked up. I wanted to say thank you, George said. Really, thank you. For keeping your promise. For not looking away. Harrison stood. I told you I wouldn't. Not for 5 seconds. Not for one, I know, George said. But I also know you didn't have to care. You could have just done your job. But you cared. Harrison's eyes softened. You're easy to care about, kid. George smiled. Then, impulsively, he hugged Harrison. The man stiffened for a moment, surprised. Then his arms came around George, returning the embrace. You're going to be a great king someday, Harrison said quietly. Better than they deserve. When George pulled back, his eyes were wet, but he wasn't ashamed. Fear and tears weren't weakness. They were human. Will you teach me more? George asked. More training? More skills? Every day, Harrison promised. For as long as you need me. Good, George said. Because I think I'll need you for a while. Harrison smiled. Then I'll be here. George went to his room and climbed into bed. Outside, the night was quiet, peaceful. The threats had been caught. The danger had passed. But George knew his life would never be simple, would never be easy. But it would be his. And with Harrison watching over him, with his family supporting him, with his own courage growing stronger every day, George knew something else. He would face whatever came next. Not hiding. Not afraid. Living.